So, if you are anything like the researchers I work with, you're probably feeling a lot of pressure to secure grant funding. And what a lot of people do when they're feeling that pressure is they try to have a lot of different irons in the fire to make sure that that pressure can be relieved, right? If you've got a lot of different things going on, one of them is eventually going to hit. That's the sort of prevailing attitude, right? Um, which means that you can easily find yourself submitting multiple applications during a given grant cycle. And in the sense, or, not quite simultaneously, but you might have a bunch of deadlines that are kind of stacked up against each other. And so, what we're going to talk about today is how to handle that, how to handle writing multiple grants simultaneously. So, if you're new around here, I'm Sarah Dobson. I am a research grant consultant, and my team and I help early career researchers get funded at NIH. So, let's dive in. The first thing I will say here is that I absolutely do not recommend submitting multiple grants simultaneously or stacked up close together. If you can avoid that, if at all possible, please do. And the reason that I do not recommend that you submit multiple grants simultaneously is that it splits your focus, right? If you're trying to keep a bunch of plates spinning at the same time, one of them is going to fall. At least one of them is going to fall, right? You are spreading yourself too thin. You're trying to focus on a bunch of different things at the same time. And that means that none of the grants that you're working on are getting the focus and attention that they deserve. Because remember, writing a grant of the magnitude of an R01, a big research project grant, right? A multi-year, multi-million dollar grant requires a lot of deep thinking and planning and communication with your co-writers. And if you're trying to do that across multiple large grants simultaneously, you can really get yourself into a lot of trouble and undermine the goal that you have, which is to secure grant funding, right? So it might seem counterintuitive, but if you want to give yourself the best possible chance to get funded, if you want to be serious about getting a grant funded, you want to try to provide as much focus as you can on each individual grant so that you're giving it your very best shot and not kind of scattering your attention and focus across a bunch of different projects and undermining that effort, right? So that's where I'm going to start here, is say, if at all possible, do not do this. Just focus on doing the best that you can on one grant at a time. And I am almost certain that you will get where you want to go faster than if you try to keep all of those projects going at the same time and just cross your fingers and hope that one hits, right? So that's where we'll start. But I know that for a lot of you, this is unrealistic, right? It's unrealistic to say I can only submit one grant per cycle. So what I will recommend is that you aspire to only submit one grant per cycle and really give each project the focus that it deserves. And in the meantime, I'm going to give you a few tips for how to handle working on multiple grants simultaneously until you can get to that point where you have really cleared the decks and you can only focus on one at a time, which is the best way to go about things and the fastest way to get where you want to go. So let's talk about what it looks like to work on multiple grants simultaneously. So what I recommend here is, whenever possible, that you are only PI or co-PI on one new grant per cycle. And that means that you're only sort of generating new text and new documents on one project at a time. And that's the project that's going to require the most deep work, the most deep thinking, and the most leadership and planning on your part, right? So doing that on more than one project at a time means that you are disadvantaging all of those projects, right? So you really want to, again, wherever possible, just focus on submitting one new grant per cycle where you are the PI, where you're the lead on getting the grant out the door and submitted on time. So that means if you're only PI on one new project per cycle, you'd only be resubmitting a grant as PI or acting as a co-I on other projects during a given grant cycle, right? And that's not to say that these projects aren't going to require a lot of time and effort and energy, but they'll likely require less than a new grant where you're the PI, right? So that's really, I would say, the smartest way to think about it is that you've got sort of one high priority, high energy, high capacity project. And then the other projects that you're working on require less of you than that main priority project, right? Okay, so given that, still, no matter how many projects you're working on in a given cycle, here's what you want to think about. This goes across all of the projects that you're thinking about on a given cycle. And even if you're only working on one at a time, these are things to keep in mind, okay? So, number one, give yourself a longer runway. So if you're submitting multiple grants every cycle, you're going to end up in a scenario where you're always kind of scrambling at the last minute to get these grants out the door, right? But if you have, for example, an annual grant writing plan and you can chip away at those grants over longer periods of time because you're anticipating those deadlines and you've planned it out and mapped it out appropriately, this is going to help you avoid stress and burnout. It'll give you more time for thinking and revising, and ultimately it'll produce a higher quality application because nothing good comes out of binge writing and scrambling at the last minute just to get something out of the door. You are undermining your chances of getting funded if you do that, okay? Number two, clear communication and clear expectations for your research team in terms of their contributions to getting the grant out the door and their deadlines for getting you materials, right? So this is when you are PI, when you are taking on the lead role in assembling the grant, as well as, leading the grant if and when it gets funded, right? So this is vitally important when you're PI, but it's also important when you are a co-I and you're communicating with the PI on the project so that they know what to expect from you. For example, if you're behind on your contribution and you're not going to be able to get it to them on time, you need to communicate that to the project lead so that they can plan around that, right? So always clear communication and clear expectations is absolutely vital. So next is to have a clear timeline and project management plan for writing the grant. So don't underestimate how massive a project it is to even write a grant, let alone execute the project once it's funded. So it is a huge undertaking to put together a grant proposal of the magnitude of an R01. You cannot wing it if you want to have a serious chance of getting funded. Okay, so when I say a clear timeline and plan, I mean that you have protected time in your calendar for writing and assembling the documents, and you know exactly what each of those blocks of time is for. It's not just grant writing time. It's in this block of time, I'm going to write my aims page. And in this block of time, I'm going to work on my biosketch and my colleagues' biosketches, just as an example, right? You have assigned tasks and sort of sub projects to each of the blocks of time that you have protected for your grant writing. Related to the previous point around time management and planning, do not make your time management emergency somebody else's problem. Okay. In other words, don't ask somebody else to rescue you at the last minute because you've overcommitted yourself. This is especially important if you're in a position of power or leadership over someone else. So for example, don't hand your postdoc a section of the grant to fix with 1 day to go before the submission deadline, because they are not going to feel comfortable saying no to you or that they can't do it, right? So just be really, really careful. If you are leading a project, it is your responsibility to make sure that you are not overburdening everybody else on the team because of your own poor management, okay? Next, build in time to send your grant out for feedback outside of your research team and make sure that you have time to actually digest and incorporate the feedback, right? It doesn't make any sense, first of all, to submit a grant that hasn't been reviewed by anyone outside your own research team. You want to be able to get early feedback in advance of the peer review feedback to be able to help you anticipate and address those issues or questions or problems that may come up, right? You want to be able to see those in advance. And one of the best ways to do that until you learn to develop that skill on your own is to get outside feedback and address that before it goes into peer review, right? So that is an absolute key here. But also make sure that you actually have time to incorporate that feedback. It's one thing to make the time to actually send it out and get the feedback, but if you don't have enough time to really do anything with the feedback, you've just wasted the time of the reviewers that you've asked to do this for you, right? So make sure that you are building that time in. Again, and that goes back to point number one about giving yourself a longer runway, right? And I know it might seem ludicrous to start a grant 6 months out or more from an actual submission deadline. But what you will notice is that you will end up with a much higher quality grant at the end of it that has a much higher chance of getting funded. Okay. And then finally, remember that if you haven't cleared your calendar of other commitments, you're going to be writing these grants while you're doing a bunch of other stuff, okay? Which can be extremely stressful. But even if you have temporarily cleared your calendar of other commitments, remember that you're going to have to pick up those commitments after the grant is submitted. And if you've been working on multiple grants simultaneously, you are going to be very tired, if not completely burned out, right? Another reason to focus on one grant at a time, and more importantly, another reason to build grant writing and integrate it more into your professional life in a more meaningful way so that you're not going through these write, burnout, recover cycles all the time. And you're not binge writing your grants and scrambling and putting them in at the last minute, that you've really built this into your professional life in a more substantial way. And you've also been really careful about what you commit to beyond the core work so that you actually have the time to protect on your calendar to be able to do this, right? So bottom line here, you really want to avoid writing and submitting multiple grants in the same cycle as much as possible because it's really splitting your time and your attention and your focus, which undermines all of the grants that you're submitting, right? If you want to get serious about getting funded, you in some ways do need to put all of your eggs in one basket when it comes to a certain grant cycle, because that really allows you to focus and do the deep work and really think about how to communicate the value of your research to your reviewers in a way that's much, much harder to do when you're spreading yourself across multiple projects. But if you do have to, at least in the short term, submit multiple projects in a cycle or in deadlines that are kind of stacked up against one another, make sure that you have a clear plan, a clear timeline, clear expectations and communications with your team, and that you have built in enough time to get good feedback and actually incorporate it into your grant. Okay? So if you found this useful, I encourage you to head over to our website and sign up for our resource library. It's completely free and it has a lot of tools and tutorials and other materials in there for you to help you write a stronger NIH grant. You can access the free resource library through the link in the video description, and you can sign up there. Again, it's completely free and it's full of tools and resources to help you write a stronger NIH grant. All right, see you next time.